The following is a recording of a real poker coaching session. To find out more about available coaching packages and courses, head to pokerfluency.com today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the video. I thought the best place to start with, obviously, is to take a look through the assessment and just discuss some of the things that came out of that. I think there are certainly a couple of areas that I think we would have a good foundation to start looking into for the sessions that we have left after this. But in general, everything was overall, everything's pretty good. Like, you're in a good place in terms of understanding a lot of the key concepts, obviously. But I think to break it down and go into it in some more detail, we'll find a couple things that we can look at. Can you see the screen share coming through?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I'm just going to skim through a lot of the stuff that you got like absolutely correct. I'm just going to mostly gloss over it, but I've marked things, I've highlighted stuff. Like, anything that's in yellow there's something iffy about it, or anything that's in green is totally fine. Anything that's in like red or orange, just need to change that. This overall perspective stuff, this is just good for giving me an idea of how you're approaching overall kind of big picture. I think the reason why I marked this as yellow is that all of this is like, I feel like this whole sort of paragraph it's just a long-winded way of saying they're really good. Like, it's just, there's not anything specific, right? They have strong fundamentals, adjusting to the player pool. They understand when people are folding too much or calling too wide. Like, all of this is just, they play good poker.
Yeah.
I think from other people I've had, I think they 3-bet more than I do, or I think they bluff more than I do, or things like this. So it's just an interesting observation there as far as how we're looking at it.
Like I was saying to you previously, I find it difficult sometimes to write what I'm actually thinking, putting it down in a clear and concise way. So sometimes I do end up waffling in a lot of spots when I write, because my mind's going in all different directions, thinking about what to say.
I totally get that.
When I saw that question, I actually found it quite difficult. And I think that's why I probably generalized for the answer, because I feel like you only truly know what good players are doing if you know them, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
I guess I would partially agree. Which is that
you can make assumptions what makes a good player. That's why I've generalized it, because my assumptions are that they have to be really good knowing the fundamentals to start off with. So they have to have a really good base of where to start. And then they adjust they know what to do against different profiles. So, for example, they know what exploits are available against population, and also even against other regs as well. There might be certain, because you've got your different types of regs, haven't you? You've got your loose aggressive, you've got tight aggressive. So that's why
I think you're right. Nothing that you're saying there is incorrect. I think all I would really say, though, is that the edge can only exist in places where the player pool is playing somewhere away from optimal, right? So the biggest winners in your games are going to naturally have an approach that reflects the weaknesses that exist in the player pool. And generally speaking, since the player pool is not like wildly aggressive and loose and constantly bluffing, like, we're not playing in some kind of absurd player pool full of whales, generally, like, the more aggressive players are going to be the bigger winners, because the generalized exploit that exists, you've been through the whole detox stuff, you've seen how much overfolding exists in so many different nodes. The general idea is players are going to understand that the player pool is largely not aggressive enough. And I think that the main point here really is just that an exploit can only exist in a spot where a weakness exists. And largely they're going to have a very close to optimal approach, and then they're going to understand the spots where overfolds are existing and things like that. But this is not something worth spending a ton of time on. It's good that you identified, you have an understanding here of where your leaks are. But I would say also that being a bit too sticky is a general way to describe a leak. What you might say here is underfolding in certain situations, like not bluff catching too much or something like that. But this is all the general stuff, like not super important to go into super detail here. So we'll skip to some points where we have more to talk about. The stuff relating to EV, all of this is very reasonable, very good. I did want to kind of address this question about position, though, because there's a couple of things here that I think are a little bit of a misapplication of the concept, right? The first thing is that part of why position is valuable, I see where you're coming from in terms of information. And trust me, literally almost everybody that's answered this question has used the word information in their answer. But in fact, information is not part of the equation, because if you think about it, in a lot of situations, when you're in position, the out of position player is just going to check their entire range over to you anyway. So being in position doesn't gain you any information relative to being out of position in that particular context.
Yeah.
So
I
in
think
fact,
it becomes more pertinent when it's multi-way.
yeah, that's certainly true.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. But what I'm leaning towards here is that the benefit of position is that it allows the in position player, being in position allows a player to make polarized decisions or to take polarized action more frequently. It's a lot harder for the out of position player to use a polarized strategy, to adopt a polarized range, because the out of position player also has to worry about how their checking range plays after they check and once they bet. The in position player, when they check, if they check a middle strength hand, it's all right. If they check a medium strength hand, they just get to showdown or they get to the next street. So it's easier for the in position player to take polarized action. The other thing here as well that I would mention is that pot control is not real, the way I describe it, in that, yes, it's true that you control the size of the pot on that street, in the sense that if you check, you get to see the next street. But first of all, when you bet on that street, you can bet small and then they just raise and now the pot's big, right? So that doesn't control the size of the pot. And then secondly, you can just check back the flop and then they can just like overbet, geometric size the turn, and now the pot's big again. So pot control is a concept that only really applies when your opponent is letting you do whatever you want, right? It's when they're playing into your hands a little bit. And against better players, pot control is not really an element of the equation. Position does, in some sense, allow you to extract more value from strong hands. But again, we're not really tailoring our size based on our opponent's actions. We're kind of tailoring our size based on the range of hands that they have. And in a lot of cases, they're going to check their whole range from out of positions. We don't gain anything from that as well. Yeah. So really, the main benefit of position is tied to polarized action. That's the thing here. Now, the equity realization question, not super important to go into here because you mostly got it right. Raw equity is a percentage. That's what you kind of almost flip this around a little bit, is that raw equity is a percentage and equity realization is the portion of your raw equity that you stand to win. So equity realization can be a percentage.
That's if you was to ask me this question now, I'd probably explain it as, so you in position, you're always going to over realize your equity because you've got the luxury of being in position, and then being out of position, you're always going to under realize. So for example, it might be a spot where when you're in position, you might realize or over realize a spot of might be 120% in position, but out of position, the same hand might only realize 80% of its equity.
And that's exactly what we're saying. But what I wanted to highlight here is just the idea that raw equity is not the amount our hand is worth. Raw equity is also a percentage, right? Equity is always a percentage. Okay, next one, pot odds. Yeah, the pot odds answer is really good. The only thing that I would say is that implied odds is like an old school poker concept that is not particularly well defined, because there isn't really a mathematical way to calculate implied odds at all. Like everybody back in the day, everybody used to say, "Oh, call with a pocket pair if it's less than X percentage of your stack or whatever." But we know now that sort of was just made up, and that's not a real thing. So implied odds it's a concept. It's like we can understand what we mean by it, but it's separate from pot odds, and in particular, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because like even when I've always considered implied odds in spots when you start getting shorter stacked more than anything, because obviously if implied odds did exist, then the shorter you are, the less implied odds you have. So I always assumed
that's true.
And you see something different though when you're using a solver. So for example, like it defends like pairs in a 3-bet pot when you're not getting implied odds. So that just for me, it confirms that implied odds isn't really a thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So what you're referring to there is that when we're calling a bet in any capacity, especially on the earlier streets, or particularly on the earlier streets, there are just so many things that can happen after we call that bet. When we call a 3-bet with a pocket pair, Sometimes we win at showdown. Sometimes we make a set. Sometimes we turn that hand into a bluff. There's just too many things that can happen.
Yeah.
So implied odds are not something we need to consider. But I would say generally, obviously this answer is fine. Nothing too much to look at there. This polarization question, pretty accurate, but the only reason I marked this in yellow is because it's not like it's not by necessity that a polarized or a large river bet can't include top pair, depending on the circumstance.
Yeah.
Top pair could easily be part of that range. This one's good. Thinking in terms of ranges, that's fine. This one's also good. The only reason I marked this yellow here is just that board texture and range and nut advantage are the same thing in the sense that board texture dictates who has range and nut advantage, right? Or equity and nut advantage. And then stack depth is, when we're talking post flop, we're talking SPR and not stack depth, right? So just slightly different there, but yeah, otherwise generally good. This is fine, although what I would have liked to see in this one here is a mention of the concept of indifference, right? So the idea of forcing opponents into tough decisions, specifically
is the indifference bit.
Exactly. Specifically, we want to make them indifferent. That's the goal there. So all of that is good as well. This is all good about bet sizing. The only thing that I would say as far as a tweak here is just that a larger bet size demands a stronger, more polarized range. The problem is that a stronger range and a more polarized range are two completely different concepts, right? A stronger range implies a range that has more overall equity, but polarization describes the distribution of equity within a range. So a polarized range has a strong part of it, but not all of it. So what I think you're referring to here is that a larger bet size demands a stronger value betting range. So the value part of that polarized range needs to be stronger.
Yeah.
And I think go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it's one of the things I've tried to study is what's the word I'm looking at? What's the bottom of your value range?
The value threshold. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Thresholds.
Right.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
So I always try to look at what's my value threshold. So in a spot on an A-side board, it might be A10 is the threshold. So I know at that point, anything in between or lower than A10, I check back or I incorporate some checks in the...
Yeah. Like I say, nothing about this is wrong. It's just important that we recognize that what you're referring to here is you're referring to the range as a whole, but actually what you're describing is the value part of the range. The value part of the range needs to have hands that can comfortably handle a raise or get called by worse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the multi-way answer here, none of this is incorrect, but the thing that I think is important to identify about multi-way pots is it's not just that equities drop and it's harder to bluff and things like that. It's that because equities drop, our value bet thresholds change when we're multi-way. It's harder to bet certain hands for value. It's harder to put a certain amount of money in the pot for value with certain hands. It's almost impossible to take polarized action multi-way. And so that's what dictates our changes in strategy. It's specifically that the value bet thresholds are changing, which also changes the bluffing frequencies. This GTO is all good. This one I marked in yellow just because I know the whole detox approach is all based on just range betting everybody, but I do think that it's not a guarantee that c-betting range is always the best option, even if your opponent's overfolding. Because
to be honest, that's one thing I don't do anymore. That's one thing. There's a few things that I didn't agree with the detox strategies, and that's one of them, is that I don't c-bet range anymore on every single spot. So I'll have different sizes on the flop as well. Yeah,
that's completely reasonable. But this is just doesn't have to be a range c-bet just because they're overfolding. This is all good. The only thing that I would have added in here as far as the description of the solver is to point out that the solver is an iterative process, that it doesn't just run calculations, it runs iterations. So it runs the strategy back and forth with both players adapting to each other billions of times, and that's how it arrives at the strategy.
An
equilibrium.
Say the word.
Yeah, equilibrium. Yeah, exactly. So that's just the important aspect there, because calculation could imply that maybe it's just an equity thing. So not really a huge deal, but yeah. Okay, as we get into some of these more strategy based, I did notice like a lot of your answers are like It's very, I do this more so than what the actual strategy is. So talking from the first person, if it throws me off a little bit, you have to forgive me there because I'm just trying to think about
obviously when I'm reading the questions, I'm answering them as me doing
right.
playing the strategy.
But I think what we want to identify is a lot of the time here, like particularly with questions like this, we're talking about what influences the correct range, like the optimal range, the right answer of what the range should be, more so than what you would do, right?
Yeah.
And because in general, what we want is we want to avoid getting tied up in or attached to an idea of this is how I play, because really we want to be able to play in any number of different ways based on what the environment is dictating. Yeah. But a lot of these specific questions are all about the theory of what is the correct range width. And so you're not wrong about any of this. It's just when you talk from a first person perspective, ideally, we shouldn't be in a case where this is my strategy. It should be, this is the right strategy. So
yeah. I understand that now. Obviously, we're chatting about it, but when I'm reading, this is what I mean as well. I think my wife says I've got autistic traits as well.
Probably, yeah, I do. It's like, it's a lot of poker players do.
Yeah. And because I've got a son who's Asperger's, so he's on the spectrum and stuff. And I just wonder sometimes whether I'm like that in certain things. So with things like this or any written type of work, it's a lot of it is done in this method. Whereas if we chat about it and we discuss it, I find it a lot easier to answer questions and explain what you wanted from it. So in that spot, if I'd have known, I'd have wrote things like it's influenced by a number of variables, things that are going to affect. So stage of the tournament, stack depth, who are in the blinds. You've just got a lot of things to consider when you're considering opening any type of hand from what position in any game. I'd have probably answered it totally different if we'd chatting about it.
I'm not saying that you got it wrong at all. Like nothing about this is wrong, especially considering it's in a chip EV tournament section. So we're not talking about stage of the tournament. So you didn't get it wrong at all. I just mean that I want to make sure that whether you answer the questions from like first person, like I do this or not, it doesn't really matter ultimately. I just wanted to make sure that we're not too tied up in the idea that there's a specific way that you play. The way that you play should be dictated by what the best play is in any given situation. So there should be some times where you have the capacity to play really tight and sometimes where you play really loose and so on. Because I see players a lot of the time, they have this idea in mind of this is my sort of style of play, but in reality, you don't need to have that. You want to be able to play any number of different ways, right? So all of this is reasonable. Just wanted to highlight that. So this one is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. We talk about polarized range versus merged 3-bet range. You mentioned using this approach when the opponent is opening wide and likely to fold often, and then using this approach when the merged approach when someone's opening tighter or calling 3-bets more often. There's not really a correlation between the width of the opening range and how polarized our 3-bet range should be. It isn't really, there's not really any significant element there. And the reason is because we are almost always developing a 3-bet range off of, first of all, keeping parts of the opening range indifferent. Second of all, usually choosing bluffs that are going to benefit from capitalizing on the raise folds. For example, like 3-betting a lot of suited hands that can fold out better offsuit hands. But, excuse me, there's not really anything that inherently makes polarized 3-betting better when ranges get wider. In fact, if you start to look at a whole bunch of different sims, you'll see that there's plenty of spots where wide opening range faces quite a linear 3-betting range. If you look at like 200, 300 big blinds deep, you do a lot of, someone opens the cutoff and you do more 3-betting from the button than you do calling. And it's a very linear 3-bet range because you're super deep and you just want to grow the pot. Not really correct here that looser open equals more polar 3-bet or tighter open equals more merged 3-bet. But this part, the idea that merged 3-bets are slightly better against players who call and see flops frequently, that's appropriate. The only thing that I would add in here that's meaningful is that specifically one of the biggest determinants here is where is the EV coming from for different parts of the range. So in a polarized 3-bet range, the range is either directly gaining EV from being able to get value, so get called or get action from hands that are worse, And then the bluff part is going to directly benefit from getting a fold from better hands. In a merged range, some of the hands in a merged range benefit in multiple different ways. So for example, if we are 3-betting a merged range and we 3-bet a hand like Queen Jack suited, right? That hand can benefit from getting King Jack offsuit to fold. It can benefit from getting Jack 10 suited to call. It can benefit from being slightly ahead of like pocket fours or something. It can benefit from having good equity against an ace high hand. There's a bunch of different ways that hand gains some degree of EV. So it's not clearly a value bet or clearly a bluff. And that's the key determinant there, that in a merged range, some of the hands will be not easily identified as either value bets or bluffs, which is a little bit different from a linear range. In fact, I should have included a question here about what's the difference between a merged and a linear range. And actually, I'm curious, do you feel like you have an answer for that? What is the difference between a merged and a linear range?
See, now I'd have thought they were quite similar in nature. But now, because I've never been asked that question before, and it's got me thinking about it. And I'm thinking a merge range is when it's a range that you can go for thin value with. And then your linear range is that your hands are towards the top of the spectrum or the matrix. The matrix, if you look at a hand matrix, or the hands towards the top, so it like creates an arrow, if that gives you a visual. And then a merge range might not be like that, because it could well depend on the flop, turn, river. It depends. A lot of the time you might, so for an example, on the turn, if we've got like a good top pair with c-bet flop got called, and then a kind of not a great card comes on the turn, but you still feel that you still need to merge the turn and maybe bet medium size, because you can still get called from worse hands.
Okay, slow down a little bit. Slow down a little bit, because we're going way off track here. Because we're talking about 3-betting, and you're going into talking about betting the turn, right? So,
I was trying to describe or the difference between what I thought is a merge range,
right? But you already covered it, and then you like went way off track. So, like the general idea here is a linear range is a range that almost exclusively benefits from getting action from worse hands. So it's basically a range of only value. It's just some of that value might be thinner value, right? So there might be some hands in there that are not super strong, but all of it is benefiting from getting action from worse. That's the main source of EV for a linear range. There isn't any part of that range that benefits to any significant degree from getting folds from better hands. And then a merged range is where specifically, like I explained, or like I mentioned, there's multiple different sources of EV. Like sometimes you get better to fold, sometimes you get worse to call. There's more than one different sort of method there, right? So that's the main differentiation. That a linear range, really, you can look at a linear range as being like a polarized range without the bluffs, right? It's just the value part, except it's a little bit wider than that. It's just like only really value, whereas a merged range, there's some hands in there that aren't really value, but aren't really bluffs either, right? So that's the main difference there. Going onwards, this is the first area where I felt like there's some stuff that I think we would want to cover in a bit more detail in a session specifically here, just because looking through your description here of how you're going to be defending the big blind and how you're going to be constructing your big blind defense here, it's certainly, there's some stuff in here that's a little bit superfluous, in that if you're calling 70% of hands, we know that there's going to be all these hands in here. I think what I wanted to address here is the 3-bet construction, because one thing that you didn't really kind of address or like specifically mention here is the idea that when we're in the big blind, by nature, our 3-bet range is going to be more polarized than it is in any other position, right? We're always going to be 3-betting more polar from the big blind. So in this case, there's actually quite a lot of situations here where facing a button open, hands like suited aces actually don't particularly want to 3-bet, because they just end up they don't get enough better aces to fold, but they actually get worse hands to fold, or they get hands to fold that they don't want to fold. And then a lot of the suited broadways as well, there are some that can 3-bet, especially at 100 bigs, like they basically become thin value. But again, this is also a region of hands that doesn't particularly 3-betting from the big blind. The only time will be when we can actually get occasional better broadways to fold here. And by contrast, some of the suited connectors are going to be reasonable bluffs in this type of a spot. But at 100 big blinds against the button, you'll actually find that there's a lot of middle suited hands.
Yeah. I think this is one of those spots where I've been a bit generic, because I've probably missed that it was facing an open from the button, and I've been a little bit generic with it.
Maybe.
Because I know in that spot, I'm actually probably not 3-betting like some strong suited broadways as much. I'm more going with the middling suited connectors, like your 10-8 suited, your Jack-9 suited, Jack-8 suited.
And that's reasonable, yeah. It's just that's not included in this answer. That's the whole thing.
Yeah. Like, I've been too generic with that, I think.
Yeah, I think, Otherwise, stuff like including like some of the ace jack off, and there's just stuff in here. And this is where I started to get a bit concerned about like the whole using AI to correct it thing, because stuff like, I also 3-bet a few offsuit broadways, like king, queen off and ace jack off when I expect folds or weaker calls. Like this is super generic, because like expecting folds, like if we expect to fold, why would we 3-bet ace jack offsuit? Because it's quite a good hand and we want to get value from worse if we 3-bet ace jack offsuit, right? And then weaker calls, like these are two completely different things. If we expect a lot of folds, we wouldn't 3-bet ace jack offsuit. If we expect weaker calls, we would 3-bet ace jack offsuit. So
it's just because I put them like two examples in there, because like king queen off, yeah, I know it's okay in some spots, but that can benefit from some folds sometimes, because you can fold out some
only if we're getting folds by hands that are dominating us, right? The only time king queen off is going to really benefit from getting folds is if we are specifically going to get something like ace queen or ace king to fold. Like most of the time, the benefit of 3-betting king queen off is that we actually do get flatted by worse hands. We get flatted by king jack off or king jack suited, like queen jack suited, stuff like that. But bottom line, we don't need to go too deep into this. I just meant that I do think it would be useful to look at some of these deep stacked approaches, because this was not the only question that related to deep stacks where the answer was a bit iffy. So we'll go into that in a second. Here are the questions about squeezes. A lot of this is pretty good, with the exception that small suited aces aren't usually great squeeze hands. It's usually a lot of the suited broadways. I would say when the open comes from late position, adding more bluffs and medium hands, more linear, kind of true. Not. In fact, what you will see is that when the open comes from later positions, that's when squeeze ranges start to become a bit less linear. They actually do start to have some polarity to them, because of the fact that when we're in the blinds, we have a bit more chance to call. I think the other thing that I would say is a little bit iffy here is squeezing a tighter range with multiple callers. And the reason I say that's iffy is because if there's a lot of callers in the pot, in most cases, that's an indication that these players have ranges that are too wide. Because in an optimal environment, the frequency that multiple players call is going to be very low. So if you are seeing multiple calls, usually that's a cue that we actually want to squeeze pretty aggressively, because those calling ranges are probably going to contain hands that shouldn't be in there. So if it was true that we were playing against optimal opponents, then squeezing tighter with multiple callers might be good. But there's more money in there. And especially if we get 3 or 4 callers, there's a lot of situations where we can just squeeze super, super wide. So we do want to be aware of that. That dead money is extremely important. And then this was the next one that made me think that looking at some deep stack stuff would be useful, because when you mentioned when stacks are 200 bigs or deeper, play a lot more carefully. It's true that mistakes cost much more, but there's also, we don't have to anticipate that we're going to make mistakes, right? Like ideally, we just want to not make the mistakes and continue playing hands. This is where we start to get pretty iffy. Like flatting more often at deep stacks, flatting more often, especially out of position to keep pot smaller. This is a little bit of a kind of flashing neon warning sign, really, because when we are deep stacked, the downside of being out of position is much more significant. The equity that we realize is less, the disadvantage is greater, and generally, that's what actually leads us to do less calling from out of position at deep stacks and more like 4-betting or folding, or less big blind defending and more 3-betting and things like that. So keeping pots smaller isn't really a concern. It's not really a thing that we have to worry about, especially because if we're playing deep stacked and we're playing chip EV, then the size of the pot is irrelevant, right? If we're playing chip EV, it's just chip EV poker. So small pot, big pot, we just play whatever pots we need to. So this makes me feel like we should take a look at some deep stack stuff, because we definitely don't want to be too passive out of position in these spots. And certainly it's easy to miss a lot of 4-bets and miss a lot of opportunities to grow pots and take advantage of players making mistakes at deep stacks here. Yeah. This is very reasonable, becoming more suited and connected. That's totally fine. So it doesn't seem like there's anything about your actual 3-bet ranges that's going to be super necessary to change or anything like that. All of this seems pretty reasonable. It might just be your response against 3-bets or response against 4-bets, something like that. And this is an alarm bell too, right? Because your 4-bet range being this tight is only really going to be a good thing if your opponents are extremely tight with their 3-bets. And I don't think it's that likely that you're playing in environments where the 3-bet ranges are this tight. So I certainly think we would want to look at what some 4-bet ranges would be like, what some appropriate responses, even at 100 big blinds, just recognizing against various sort of configurations of 3-bets, like what your 4-bets need to look like. Because it's true that there are a lot of spots where this is the value range that you want to have. But if you're pretty much never 4-bet bluffing, then that just implies that you're missing out on a lot of opportunities to apply pre-flop aggression, create bigger pots, and also just put pressure on these opponents. You're very correct that players can call 4-bets in position when deep stacked, but that just because they can call doesn't mean that we have to like avoid that. There's plenty of spots where we want them to call. If they're calling that much, like we should just 4-bet like ace 10 suited for value. Like eventually it just gets to a point where them calling a lot is good. So I think we should take a look at some deep stack stuff, because it is obviously, if you're playing high volume, it's pretty good to just maximize your EV in those early stages. So that's something that we can certainly look at. And yeah, keeping pots small doesn't have any inherent value when you're playing chip EV. All of that is just something that we can maybe adapt to. The mixed strategy question here, the only thing that is missing here a little bit is that you're right about mixing and the benefit of protecting our range and things like that. But the missing thing is that the reason why mixed strategies exist is because the EV of flatting and the EV of 3-betting are the same. That's the missing ingredient here. It's that simply it doesn't matter on an individual hand basis. If our opponent is playing a fixed strategy, a fixed GTO strategy, then it doesn't matter whether we flat or 3-bet, the EV is the same, right?
Yeah. Now, obviously, I just answered that is in that mindset again, thinking, answering it from personal or something that you've learned, something I've learned in the past, thinking, mixed strategy, it's just to keep the opponent guessing, kind of thing, so they don't know whether you've got a value hand or nothing.
And that's not wrong. That's the whole thing. But specifically, the EVs are the same. And what happens is if your opponent is able to adapt, then that can cause us to lose EV, which is if we're playing against an opponent who is capable of adapting, that's why we would want to employ a mixed strategy. But I guess the main point of this question was to identify the idea that if the reason mixed strategies exist in theory is because the EVs are the same. Then we've got, this is all very reasonable, suited aces. This is all good. King, Jack, and Queen 10, that's fine. This is pretty reasonable too, although we didn't really say like how big we would ISO and anything like that, but not really a big deal. This is one that I wanted to address here. The appropriate response to a table of loose passive players is not to open wider and use smaller raises. That is actually pretty much the worst thing you can do, because you're at a table of loose passive players. When you open wider, you are in most cases going to now be opening hands that are actually not getting the folds that they're supposed to get. And instead they're getting continued by hands that are actually dominating them. Opening up your suited connector range or opening wider in general there is going to lead to more domination and less equity realization for you post flop. So what you actually usually want to do is open slightly tighter than normal and slightly larger than normal, because if your table is very loose passive, then they're not going to be doing a lot of 3-betting, which means that your strong hands, the top of your range needs to, you need to get the money in the pot yourself instead of waiting for them to do it. Larger sizes and tighter ranges is where we want to go, not wider ranges and smaller sizes. Then against multiple aggressive 3-betters, tightening your opening ranges, somewhat reasonable here. Slightly smaller opens is also good. The only thing that I would say is that it's not mandatory to tighten your opening ranges because A, it's very possible for an opponent to be an aggressive 3-better without actually 3-betting as much as what an optimal strategy wants to do.
Yeah.
And B, if they are 3-betting more than an optimal strategy, then it actually makes even more EV to just continue opening a normal range and then just 4-bet whenever they 3-bet. That's actually making more money. So it's not mandatory to tighten up just because they 3-bet a lot. Then we've got, okay, so player folding too often to 3-bets. Like this, everything here was pretty accurate and reasonable, except for this, because this part doesn't really make a lot of sense. If they're folding a lot anyway, you don't have to increase your 3-bet size. In fact, it works the opposite. If they're folding, if they're very inelastic to your 3-bets and they're just folding too much in general, you can just 3-bet slightly smaller than you normally would because you're essentially achieving the same result for a cheaper price. So going bigger against tighter players isn't really necessary. This one's all very good. Capped pre-flop ranges. 10-9 suited better than King-9. That's also good. This one's pretty good. Removing certain hands in passive environments. This is mostly good. The main reason for 3-bet sizing being larger out of position is to, it's this SPR one, but it's also to keep their opening range indifferent more easily. Because if we did size too small, they would have too many easy calls. And that's just the main thing here. So generally, this is pretty good.
So that's one thing I've picked up with using Octopi Poker as well, is been sizing my 3-bets out of position way too small.
Yeah, most people do. A lot of people do.
Yeah, I've been going way too small. And since I've increased the sizing, I felt it's better both for even, obviously, you get a slightly more folds. But I think the main benefit is that it makes it easier to play post-flop.
Yeah, easy or difficult to play is all relative to how well we understand the spot. That's the thing. Yeah. Ideally, if we know the spot really well, even a complex spot is going to get slightly easier to play. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Larger 3-bet sizes are going to make sense here because they're just better, they're more correct. Now, the next one here, flatting in position with strong but not premium hands. The only thing I think is missing here is that you did highlight keeping weaker hands in the pot. It's not so much about avoiding facing a 4-bet. It's more just that the main reason to 3-bet would be that we can get value from worse. And if we can't get value from a lot of worse hands, flatting is going to make more sense. So that is good right there. Yeah. Board coverage, this is good as well. This is a good answer. This is pretty reasonable. Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably not a great question, so I don't want to spend too much time on this one. The 987 isn't a great example here because it is actually a decently high frequency c-bet board in most cases. So it does connect with a lot more pairs and straights and things like that. But in fact, this is not a great choice of board because it is a range advantage board for a lot of c-betters in a lot of spots. So we won't worry too much about that. So this is, okay, so this one with regard to bet sizes, none of this is incorrect, but I do think that you're falling into some traps that players often do when it comes to not really knowing why certain sizes are actually correct. So what it comes down to here is that it all relates to the hands at the top and the bottom of your opponent's range. So the reason why something like a drier board like Queen 5-3, smaller c-bets are going to be good is not really related to the board not changing much on later streets and only related to your opponent having missed. It's mostly related to the idea that you have an advantage at the bottom or in the middle of the range. So the bottom of your range is stronger than the bottom of your opponent's range, which basically means that the bottom of your range becomes a value bet, right? You're almost like value betting your 10 highs here because your opponent's range is so wide and so weak. So that's why we're able to bet small in some of these situations. And the more weak hands your opponent has, the wider their range is. That's why it creates these range bet boards on these types of textures. And then conversely, sizing up on more connected or more dynamic boards, it isn't necessarily because of anything to do with protecting your equity or building the pot with your strong hands or anything like this, really. Actually, mostly because our opponent has a lot of medium equity hands on these boards. They do have some strong equity hands, but they have a lot of hands that have 35, 40, 45% equity. And usually on these boards, if we're going to bet, then we either need to bet with some kind of a size that puts a little bit of pressure on some of those medium hands, or we need to not bet at all. Because in general, a small bet just doesn't really achieve anything on these textures. So things like building the pot and all that sort of thing, it's secondary to the fact that our opponent has a lot of medium hands on these boards, and that's why larger sizes make sense. But it's also worth noting that a board like Jack 10-8, depending on the spot, this board actually can quite easily be a small bet board. So it's not by any means a guarantee that just because there's straights and flushes and stuff out there, that makes it a big bet board. So what we want is to break some of these links here that we have between board texture and sizing, because really what it comes down to is the top and the bottom of the opposing range. And we'll do a session where we talk in more detail about that. There's a lot of pretty easy and simple shortcuts you can use to build strategies more easily there. But what you will find if you go through some aggregate reports and things like that, you'll find plenty of situations where there's some little bit of some unusual spots where Jack 10-8 becomes a small bet or something like that. And I'll tell you in a minute another example of a board that I think you gave an example of a small bet board that's actually a big bet board, and I'll explain that in a second. So this is a good description of equity advantage versus nut advantage. I think the way that I'm developing things now and the way that I'm starting to talk about things more is I would tend to talk about, as opposed to equity advantage and nut advantage, I would talk about top of range advantage and bottom of range advantage, because I think that's a little bit easier when you start to look at it in more detail.
That's linked to something you were just talking about then,
right?
Where you said when you're bottom of range, he's better than the bottom of range.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like I say, we'll go into more depth in that later on. Why does position matter so much for equity realization? This is not a great question as well, because we covered this already, but I would say stuff like controlling the flow of the hand, it's not really a real thing. And again, information not really particularly important. This examples, it's okay. Acting last lets you realize a higher percentage of your hand's equity, but really it's the ability to check the middle of your range and see the next street and then make polarized decisions with top and bottom. That's the main thing here. So this is the other thing that I wanted to highlight. So you mentioned when facing a small c-bet, I said, the question was pick a small bet board texture, right? And you picked 973 rainbow. This is absolutely
a large bet.
Absolutely not a small bet board texture. This is like a shovel money in with an overbet kind of texture. You're not
Jaws that one.
So you're not like incorrect in terms of the hands that you listed as check raise candidates, although you probably need more backdoors here if you're gonna check raise this board against a small bet if your opponent does use a small bet. But yeah, this is not a small bet board. So I do want to make sure we cover some of those ideas about analyzing textures and sizing and things like that. This question about firing the turn with a double barrel, I think most of what you said is pretty good. I like that you were very like sequential with 1, 2, 3, all of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that are a little bit off. We mentioned my range advantage from the flop mostly holds. The problem is that when you start to go to turn and river, talking about overall range advantage becomes more complex, because now that you've bet the flop and they've called, they have a lot fewer weak hands because they just folded all their weak hands, but you still have a bunch of weak hands. So in fact, what's happening is you no longer have an overall equity advantage. You no longer have a bottom of range advantage, but because you have a top of range advantage, because you have more strong hands than they do, that's what allows you to still be the aggressor here. So just because they check called, they're actually still somewhat capped and so on. So this is the interaction between top of range advantage and bottom of range advantage. This is targets to fold here. Yeah, you're probably going to get some pocket pairs to fold sometimes. You're probably going to get some 7x, like King X almost never folds. Yeah, King X never folds here. That's true. This is good. Talking about the spade. This though, this is where I marked it in red here, because this is a pretty clear overbet spot on the turn here, as opposed to a small to medium kind of a spot, because your value range for a second street here is going to be like a strong king plus. You're not going to bet a second street with like pocket eights or something. So it's just a polar spot. It's deliberately designed as like a geometric size spot here. Just go 2E.
Yeah, I think I went with the detox mindset in that spot, where they bet small on the flop, bet medium on the turn, and then obviously quite big on the river kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think this is where we're getting to the point where, like, in an environment where everybody's folding way too much, like that might be pretty good, but we're moving away from that, or where I haven't seen detox's like data recently. It's been 5 years since I saw the stuff that they had, but I can't imagine that the player pool's weaknesses are still quite as big as they used to be there. So
I personally don't think they are. From my experience,
I doubt it.
in the last few years, to me, it feels like players have turned a corner where a lot of them used to just overfold to everything. Now, I think they're actually players are stickier. I think they're calling a lot more. I think they're bluff catching a lot more.
Yeah, it makes sense that they would be. But the logic is good here, but the sizing would be way too small. I think this is just an overbet turn. And then population tweak, that's fine. The one thing I would say is that we don't have to plan our river ahead of time. I think people get themselves way too caught up trying to plan their action for the next street. It's completely reasonable to recognize that we have the option to fire a big bluff on a spade river. But there's other things here like ace river, consider bluffing if I credibly rep ace king. Like, clearly you would be credibly repping ace king if the river came in ace. So you don't really have to think about if. It's like an ace is a river where you rep ace king, but you also have other hands that you're repping as well. So I think also the other thing here as well is total brick river often give up. Like, there's no requirement to give up there, because this is like, if you're going to give up this hand, you have to think, okay, what are the hands that I'm not giving up on a brick river? Just because the river's a brick doesn't mean we just don't bluff anything. So I don't think we need to plan ahead here. I think we just need to look street by street, because it requires enough mental energy just to build a strategy for one street, that building a strategy for the next street in advance is like an unnecessary expenditure of energy, really.
I was just going to say it could be like construed as just wasting bandwidth.
Yeah, exactly. It's what it is. Yeah. This is all reasonable. This is good about value betting. Yeah. So this is good here. Under bluffing, calling less often. It's not just that we should call less often. It's that we should, if they're under bluffing, we should never call a bluff catcher. We should just fold all bluff catchers, not just some of them.
Yeah.
The only other thing
I would say that's probably my biggest leap as a pre-flop caller is bluff catching too much. Even though I've been working on it and I don't bluff catch anywhere near as much, I'm still doing it too much.
Yeah, it's probably a good thing to work on. The value betting thinner here, this is correct, but I think it's important to recognize that the only reason it is correct is because we're specifically referring to players who don't bluff raise. So you can value bet thinner against players who don't bluff raise, but if we're talking about a scenario where the raise isn't part of the equation, like we're talking about just like shoving all in, for example, then there's no reason to change our value bet threshold there just based on the fact that they happen to be a player who's under bluffing. So that's important. Yeah, this is good. The river, every hand has realized it's full equity. The only missing thing here is that the river allows for the nuts has whatever is the nuts has 100% equity, and whatever is the nut low has 0% equity. So basically ranges diverge, or equities diverge more. So that's the only missing thing there. This one is also an interesting one, this next one about bluff catching. The reason why I've highlighted some of this in red here is because if the first thing that you're considering is the story, that's a bit of a red flag here, because there are a lot of things that are much more important than the sort of story that your opponent is telling. The idea of telling a story or whatever, this is like a little bit of a 2005 poker concept almost, where much more relevant now, or we've got all these other things here that you've correctly identified that are important, but you've put the story first, when in fact the story is last on this list. I think this might be what's causing some of your issues with bluff catching, is that you're going down the rabbit hole of assuming that your opponents are telling some kind of story, when in reality, it's much more important to just focus on the elements of the spot and the specific parameters.
Because sometimes I'll get to the river and I'll be like, what are you trying to tell me here? What are you trying to say that you've got, a kind of thing? And I'll actually even verbalize it when I'm playing. I'm like,
yeah, and that's the problem.
What are you trying to tell me here?
It's a problem because they're not trying to tell you anything. They're just playing a hand. So
yeah, and they're just value betting.
In most cases, yeah, exactly. So what needs to happen is this here, I'm going to highlight this in like a bright green or whatever, because this is by far the concept that should be at the top. This needs to be number one. Pot odds are the only thing that you should think about as soon as you see that river bet. How big did they bet? Because the pot odds that they bet that you're getting, the other thing here that is actually completely missing from this analysis is that the pot odds that you're getting and the size that they bet dictates the threshold that they can bet for value. So that dictates whether or not your hand is going to be beating any value bets, right? So bluff catching with a medium strength hand, we have to start with, okay, what are the odds I'm getting? what's the threshold of hands that my opponent can bet for value? Based on that threshold of value bets, now how many bluffs do I need them to have approximately? And then we start going into things like blockers, right? But what you've done is you put the story at the top, and a lot of the stuff that's actually most important is going way further back in the process, which is a problem. And things like range strength, this range strength is only going to come into the equation once we've exhausted everything else. And we've started to get to a point where I truly do not know how much bluffing my opponent's going to be doing here. And now I'm going to start to think about how far up in my own range am I? That's like the last resort thing that starts to matter here. So this bluff catching process, I want to spend a session kind of reorganizing this, because I think you already mentioned you have issues with this. And I think that part of the issues you're having is because you're starting from this perspective. So we definitely can correct some stuff there.
And it probably ties into emotion as well.
Probably, but the more of a systematic process that you have, the harder it's going to be for emotion to come up and make you change your decisions. You're going to have a more systematic approach to it.
Yeah, exactly. It should be more logical rather than being tied to being emotionally invested in the hand.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the next one here, blockers. I think what's interesting about this one is you've mostly just talked about unblockers, but in fact, the most important part of blockers is like, if there's three to a flush on the board and we have a card that blocks a flush, we should be a lot more likely to bluff. That's what matters here. What you're talking about is a more obscure aspect of blockers. You're talking about unblockers. So you're not wrong about any of this, but this is definitely not the key element of how blockers affect river bluffs, basically. This is very reasonable as far as description of overbets, applying them to capped ranges. There's only a couple of things that I would change here. The first thing is that like your value range on this board, opening the button and getting called by the big blind, like your value range is a lot wider than just this. But the other thing is that there's not, like you mentioned, checking back eights to have a strong hand in my checking range. This is like really arbitrary. There's not really any reason to check back eights specifically here, especially because you also have pocket kings in your range, and pocket kings is much more of a reasonable hand to check back based on the fact that it double blocks top pair, right? So checking back eights is like pulling a hand out of nowhere and doesn't really make sense. This is good. It's worth noting as well here that, of course, extracting max value with top hands is the main point here, but it's not necessarily the case that we're going to always include like bluffs like these types of hands. Quite a lot of the time when we use a polar strategy on the turn here, we're going to have a lot of bluffs that have very low equity. So it's not mandatory for us to have these hands either. This is good. That's all reasonable. All very good there as well. Now, I noticed you skipped a few of the Chip EV tournament questions, and this is partly it's just obviously partly because they have some cash game elements to them, but there's also...
Well, that's why I left that most.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. I can get rid of some of these questions, but we also, this question you didn't answer here, which skill edge, the general idea is skill edge doesn't really play any role, so we just ignore that one. Yeah, the big blind 3-bets, we talked about this already a little bit, so all of this is mostly good. The one thing I would say is the idea of I already have one blind invested. Like, you don't really want to think about it that way because it's not your investment. It's just money that's in the pot.
Yeah.
So
it's forced, it's forced, isn't it? And
once the money's in the pot, it's not your money anymore, right? Like you don't have that one blind invested. You're just getting a better price is what it means.
Yeah.
And the bluffs that you're going to have here it's not necessarily going to be bluffs with good playability. Sometimes it's going to be bluffs with just blocker value and a lot of bad playability. So that's important. This one here, I know it's cash related. I should have maybe just put deep stacked play in general here. Obviously, bet sizes are going to get smaller. So the equity denial question here is quite a useful one because on the one hand, some part of your answer here is pretty correct in the sense that equity denial, like betting, getting some of these hands to fold is going to be a good thing sometimes. On the other hand, a hand like 10-9 is not folding on King 8-6. So that's the first thing. But it's important to note here that equity denial doesn't drive your strategy. And especially it's not as relevant on wet boards and connected boards because if your opponent has above a certain amount of equity, they're just not going to fold.
They're not folding.
And if they're not folding, you're not denying any equity. So the important thing is that equity denial is a side effect of value betting. And it's a bonus where we can value bet and get called by worse, but we also have the ability to get some hands that have 25, 30, 35% equity to fold. So the best example I always give is if the flop is 5 deuce and you have pocket sixes and you bet, right? You're value betting to get called by a 5 or whatever other hands. But if you get 10-9 to fold, that's nice as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not really about actual draws. It's mostly about overcards. It's usually about overcards. And in particular, ace 7 deuce rainbow, it's still relevant here because you might value bet a hand like pocket eights where you're getting called by a 7. So you're definitely value betting, but you're also getting like Jack 10 to fold, which is kind of a benefit as well. So it's not necessarily the case that on try boards, equity denial is less valuable. In fact, it can be equally valuable, if not more sometimes.
That's why I like using the pay trainer. That's why I really enjoy it because you get
it's like octopi, by the way. I keep meaning to say it's octopi, as in the plural of octopus. It's not octopi.
All right, octopi. So when you get the visual feedback, so you're playing against George, bet the flop, and you see him fold 2 overs. Or so in some scenarios, he might even fold a pair, and you're like, result that, and you get that confirmation of what happens when you do something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It makes sense. So just quickly skimming through the rest of them, 60 big blinds, chip EV. Yeah, there's a lot of like quite generic explanation here. Some of your range construction is pretty good, but some of it is, I mean, it's hard really. Like, I'm surprised it took 4 paragraphs to explain this, honestly, but like I think there's a couple things in here that are pretty good, but there's also like the fact that your 3-bet, you mentioned your 3-bet range is built around value hands like aces to queens, ace king, and ace queen off. In this kind of spot, like ace queen off is going to mix quite a lot of flats. It's not really a distinct value hand here. The only hands that are going to be pure 3-bets for value in any given spot are going to be the hands that are actually stacking off. And because you're not stacking off with ace queen off, that just inherently means that it's going to be a mix. And then a lot of the rest of this is pretty good. Like I say, some of it is quite general, so we would have to look at some detail there if we wanted to go more. This is all good. Like, I'm glad you're c-betting more at shallower stacks. That's good. Yeah, again, this is a weird one because this is in a chip EV tournament. I guess we don't play an entire tournament of chip EV, but like yeah, I know what you mean here. Yeah. I widen my value range and reduce my bluffing. The one thing I would say here is that bluffing less is like a common thing that people do against weaker players, but it's definitely not a guarantee that's the right approach. Like, there are plenty of players who just default to being super value heavy early on against weaker players, and they don't recognize that a lot of the time that's pretty much exactly what weaker players expect you to do. And so it's very hard for them to actually make substantial mistakes against that. And the reason why players complain all the time about weaker players sucking out is because they don't realize that when you shovel in a bunch of money on the flop and turn with top set or whatever, your weaker opponent is like, they're just folding bottom pair because they're never going to bluff catch against you because they know you're never bluffing, but they're just continuing with all their draws because they know you have a good hand and they know you're going to pay off if they suck out. So it's just one of these things that refusing to bluff against weaker players actually misses the fact that there are quite a lot of good bluff spots if you're willing to actually take them. And of course, if you never actually bluff against these players, you have no idea how often they're actually folding when you bluff because you don't have a sample size. Most of this is pretty reasonable, but we just don't want to default to being too value heavy. This is pretty good here as well about equity and nut advantage. And then donking on flops that are good for our range, that's also good. I do think with the whole ICM section here, a lot of your answers were very general. There's a lot of stuff that's pretty good, like bet and raise sizes being smaller, big stacks applying more pressure. And I know some of the questions aren't really ideal here, but I would have wanted to maybe see a bit more specific kind of answers here. And I think thinking through like the stuff like some of this, like these extra chips don't increase my real money equity by we don't really talk about real money equity so much. Like there's just a few answers here that are not super specific. So I think what I would want is to dig a little bit deeper into how you're looking at some of these ICM spots and explore a little bit how you're looking at spots with higher risk premiums compared to lower risk premiums and things like that. Because it's clear that you understand risk premium, but there's not really a lot in these answers other than just there's a lot of repetition of play tight when you're a medium stack and stuff like this. Like this one here is quite interesting because you're not wrong that this is a spot where like queen 10 suited would be like a trivial shove in a lot of chip EV spots, but this is not the greatest example of a scenario where we would, let's say, be folding in ICM, because the final table bubble, like the risk premiums are not going to be that high to begin with. And queen 10 suited, blind against blind, 12 big blinds, you'd have to have an insane amount of risk premium to not shove this hand in an ICM spot. Like to not shove a suited Broadway for 12 bigs blind against blind, it would take a super high risk premium.
Yeah, I think I did this based on the direct bubble, because I remember actually having to looked at a solver just because I thought, what would I do if I had this hand in this spot? And I wasn't quite sure. So I actually looked at I looked at the solver and I look at what its jamming range would be for 12 big blinds, just to give me some confirmation of when I was thinking on the right lines.
It's not really the idea of the assessment, but
no, I know, but I had it in my head, but I thought I don't want to write this and then look really stupid for writing it.
This is why it's important, right? Like the fear of looking stupid is already, this is a direct example of the quote unquote fear of looking stupid, making it harder for me to get an accurate insight into your game, because I don't know how accurate your ideas about ICM really are. I don't know whether you would actually be folding in this spot or not. I don't know whether you're overestimating or underestimating risk premiums, all of these types of things. So I do think it's important that one of our sessions we're going to spend on some ICM stuff, because like I say, a lot of these answers don't give me a lot of insight. And especially if it might be that you found a final table bubble with 12 big blind spot, but obviously the remaining stacks, the other stacks are going to make a big difference here. And you can find some example of a spot where queen 10 suited might fold here. But a more general example that I was going to point out would be something like, we're a middle stack at a final table and somebody opens in middle position and we have like pocket deuces in the small blind for 18 big blinds. If there's two stacks at the final table shorter than us, that's a clear fold in ICM, but in chip EV, it would be a clear shove for 17 big blinds or something. So that's just a very generic example. Queen 10 suited, blind on blind, like I say, it would take a very extreme scenario to make this not a shove. But we'll move on. We'll go through the last couple of questions. This is not incorrect. Like this second paragraph is not really necessary here, but basically the reason ICM no longer applies in heads up play is because there's no third player in play to benefit from the exchange of chips between the others. No, not applying pressure, but there's ICM values change when chips are exchanged between the others because a third player can benefit. But when there's only two players, it becomes 1-to-1 again. Every chip that you lose is a chip that I gain and vice versa. So that's why chip EV, that's why heads up is chip EV. It's because there's no third player in play who can benefit. It's all 1-to-1 now. So then we've got risk premiums increasing. Yeah, this is reasonable. Yeah, the main thing here, like this is not really what I was looking for as far as the definition of bubble ICM versus final table. And the reason is that on the bubble, the ICM pressure is exerted more on the short stacks, because the short stacks, primarily, most of their EV comes from cashing the tournament. Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas at the final table, most of the ICM pressure is exerted on the middle stacks. So that's the differentiator here. It's that on the bubble, it's the short stacks who are under the most pressure. At the final table, it's the middle stacks. That's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
And then we've got this kind of answer here, which, there's some stuff here that we don't need. ICM, the chip leader, ICM changing your calling range compared to chip EV. All you really need to say here is if we're second in chips with 8 left, we probably have a pretty high risk premium. So depending on how deep we are, we're probably going to call off fairly tight, but we may not tighten up that much. And like I say, I just wanted to highlight the main thing here is, again, you don't have to go all the way through this. You just have to say risk premium is probably very high, but depending on the distribution of the other stacks, the risk premium could be 20% here, but it could only be 10%. And if it's only 10%, we're not going to tighten up that much. So that's all we really need there. And then this one, I think this is the last two here. So this one against opponents who don't understand ICM, I didn't love this answer because number one, like tightening calling ranges and trapping more often, this is generic, like doesn't really, it's not really clear to me exactly how this would gain us EV in an ICM context. And in the end, the ultimate answer is not actually this. This is not really particularly true because ICM as a model is very accurate at predicting finishing positions, even when players in the field are not playing an ICM strategy. GTO Wizard did a study on this for one of their YouTube videos. And even if you take players who are not playing an ICM strategy, the ICM model predicts finishing positions pretty well. So what it comes down to is ICM, our opponents not understanding ICM doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw ICM out the window either. In a lot of cases, what happens is that if they make mistakes that forces us to take on more variance, so if they make mistakes by playing too loose, by being too wide, then quite often exploiting that is going to cause both us and them to lose a lot of EV. But so, I mean, some of the EV that we gain from them is offsetting that, but both of us will lose EV to the rest of the field. But if they play in a way where they are actually too tight, so maybe they don't understand ICM, but they're not applying enough pressure with the chip lead, for example, right?
Yeah.
They're playing too tight. That is now a really good for us, really beneficial for us, because that's a mistake that allows us to take on less variance. So exploiting that is very beneficial. So basically, it just means that we change the way that we exploit. We focus on exploiting mistakes that allow us to lower variance, because lower variance is beneficial for our ICM value, and mistakes that force us to take on more variance tend to be a bit of a problem. And then the last one here is just about approach to heads up. Again, this is pretty generic. I don't think we need to go into it too much. Yeah, this was one of the things that made me feel like the alarm bell of, did he use AI for this? Because this feels like the kind of thing that ChatGPT would say about heads up play. It's stay aggressive, adapt quickly. These are relevant, but the main thing, identifying chip EV heads up strategy, is to recognize that there's going to be a lot of push fold if we're shallow. There's going to be this keep pressure on since position is such a big advantage. Yeah, but I would have liked to see something identifying here that, as opposed to opening most buttons, usually we're going to be like 15, 20, 25. Ooh, you still there? All right. So we had a disconnection from Lee right there. So we're going to wrap up the session right here. Thanks.